I'm recording my homily for the 5th Sunday in Ordinary Time, and we are getting very, very close to Lent. We're about a week and a half away from Ash Wednesday. I came up to visit my mom. So if you're ever looking for a place to bring the family, like for a camping trip or a day trip or something like that, this is Dungeness State Park. Beautiful place, nice little campground here, and the cliffs here are pretty impressive. You can see right behind me, there was a mudslide that happened. I'm not an expert on it, but it looks like it just happened maybe within the last day or so, because the water hasn't even come up over it yet. Now, this ties in a little bit with what I want to talk about today. So, competency. Competency is very impressive, right? When you see someone, when you get to know someone who's just really good at what they do, they're just really good at their particular profession, like a doctor or a nurse, medical personnel when you go in the hospital, and they're just really, really competent at what they do. It's impressive to see that, because you can just kind of marvel at their wisdom, at their talents at work, and being used to help someone else. Construction workers, it's beautiful to see, really, really good construction workers create something from nothing. From a bunch of wood, they create a house. It's very impressive. I am a copycat. I'm a phony construction worker. I like doing little projects, but I'll make lots of mistakes, and it never turns out professional. And so for me to step back and to watch a professional is always really nice. So competency is a beautiful thing, and we all have our competencies in different ways. So for example, someone who is competent in mudslides would say, "Father Peter, you shouldn't be standing there right now." Probably. Again, I have no idea if it's stable or not. But anyways, so being competent is always a great thing. Now, I'm going to talk about that, and I'm going to talk about two extremes today. I'm going to talk about a certain kind of spiritual incompetency and spiritual competency, and to see the beauty of the spiritual competency. And the purpose today is not to denigrate Job, because Job was in our first reading, because he's at a low point in his life. So I'm not criticizing him and saying he was a bad person or spiritually incompetent, but he's at this low point where he needs something. He needs something to be happening in his life. He needs some help, right? Okay, so in talking about spiritual competency, I'm also going to talk about spiritual depression. Spiritual depression, okay? So Job today in the first reading is depressed. I mean, he has all the symptoms of somebody who's depressed. Somebody who's depressed, they tend to be very negative about life. They tend to see all the bad things that are happening. If you talk to them, they tend to focus on themselves and their woes, their problems, their issues, all the things that are going wrong in their life. So there's somebody who's depressed. And again, I'm not saying that to be critical, because I know in my own life, there's been times where I've really struggled. And so just those are the things that happen when we succumb to whatever is going on in our life, right? So what enters into is some kind of a depression. So let's look at the first reading real quick. So in Job, what are some of the things he says that are indicative of somebody who's depressed, or even maybe even spiritually depressed, but depressed, right? So he says, "Is not man's life on earth a drudgery?" Right? Is not man's life on earth a drudgery? Isn't our life here, doesn't it just kind of stink? So not very positive, not very optimistic, right? Are not our days like those of hirelings? Aren't we just a bunch of slaves? It's like, okay, you got the rich people, but our lives, we're just a bunch of slaves. It's like, yeah, good morning, let's wake up, another great day, right? No, there's depression here. "I have been assigned months of misery, and troubled nights have been allotted to me." Somebody who's depressed often has trouble with nights because they have trouble sleeping. Maybe it's anxiety, whatever it is. They have trouble sleeping. They also have trouble waking up in the morning, right? The mornings are not very pleasant because they didn't get a very good night's sleep. "And when shall I arise? Because the night drags on, right? I am filled with restlessness at dawn." All these things are of somebody who is depressed. "My days are swifter than a weaver's shuttle." I have no idea what a Weaver shuttle is, but it obviously doesn't sound good. They come to an end without hope. And remember that my life is like the wind. We got wind today, so we're very appropriate. My life is like the wind. I shall not see happiness again. Oh, talk about depressed, right? Poor Job. Now, in talking about depression, I also want to talk about, I don't necessarily want to talk about depression. I want to talk about more is spiritual depression. So spiritual depression is when somebody has these qualities, but in the spiritual life. So, you know, your kids come to you and they say, I don't want to go to church. I don't want to go to Mass. I don't want to, you know. I'm fatigued spiritually. Spiritually, I'm depressed. Those moments when we don't want to pray, right? So let's say things haven't been going very good, or we're really, really busy in life, and so we don't feel like praying. We don't feel like having that energy to work at our spiritual life, and so that's spiritual depression. It's similar to depression, other types of depression, though it's just in all the other areas of our life. And so the same ways, people who are depressed, they tend not to like to eat healthy, right? They tend to just forage off of junk food because it takes energy to eat healthy, especially when we have so much junk food. To exercise, right? To stay healthy. Somebody who's depressed doesn't do those things. They tend to sit around watching TV or whatever. Spiritual depression ends in the same way. We stop praying. We stop volunteering. We stop doing works of charity. We stop making an effort. There's a fatigue that sets in, and we become more and more self-centered. And if that spiritual depression keeps going, eventually we're going to turn and begin to do really, really bad things, commit really bad sins, and mortal sin enters then into our life, and then it just spirals and gets worse and worse. It's kind of like someone with depression who then turns to drugs or alcohol or gambling or some other habit, pornography, and they're seeking an escape, but it doesn't help. They just spiral farther and farther into that hole. Okay, so depression is spiritual depression. Now, I want to take that and I want to offset that with spiritual competency, which results in something very beautiful. And so that's St. Paul today. St. Paul in Corinthians, he is so the opposite. Things are going spiritually for him so well. And that doesn't mean that life is easy for him. It doesn't mean that everything's going perfect, like God's blessed him with ample money and all these things. Not at all. But he's just so hungry. He's so hungry spiritually to live the faith more fully that he's the type of guy, when he wakes up in the morning, he doesn't even need an alarm clock. I mean, he is just bing, he is ready to go. St. Paul, at this point in the scriptures, is so on fire. He's so hungry with for grace and to share it. He's just bursting. So I'm going to talk about a few of the qualities of that. Okay, so he says, if I preach the gospel, this is no reason for me to boast, for an obligation has been imposed on me. Now, I know it sounds slightly negative in the way he puts it there, but when we keep going, realize that this obligation that St. Paul has, it's work, it's a mission, it is his life, and it's been given to him. And so he has every reason in the world in the morning to wake up. Somebody who's depressed, you know what they don't have? They don't have a reason to wake up. They've lost sight of their mission. They've lost sight of their neighbor and the opportunities to show love to their neighbor, and of God and the blessings that they've received from God. They've lost sight of those things. Paul has them right in the forefront of his mind. He's been given a mission. He's the type of guy right now where the night before, he's creating a list of things to do the next day, and he's excited about it. He's pumped. He's ready to go. There is no shortage of work when it comes to the gospel and proclaiming the gospel. And I have to say, in our lives, there is no short of work. I would say that on some level, maybe we're spiritually depressed in our culture, and so we don't always realize, we don't always see all the opportunities in front of us, all the blessings, but all the opportunities to show the gospel, to live the gospel, to share it. All right, let's keep going with Paul. So he says that when I preach, I offer the gospel free of charge. I offer the gospel free of charge. He's not seeing anything in what he's doing for himself. He's not looking at it as a way of gaining anything. It is simply to give of himself for the others. I don't expect anything back. That's beautiful, it's powerful. Somebody who's depressed is often focused on themselves, right? If anything, someone who's spiritually depressed has a tendency to blame God for their problems, for their woes, or blame the church, or blame other people. Paul is totally not in that mode. He is, how can I give more? How can I do more? It's a great place to be, right? Now, I hope what you're hearing also in this, you're hearing a certain spiritual competency. He is not a man in fear. He's not thinking, I really don't know how to do that. I don't know how to bring the gospel to these people. I don't know what to say. Now listen to what he's about to say right now. He's so competent in what he's doing. And when I say competent spiritually, it doesn't mean that he got a PhD in theology. He's close to God. That's spiritual competency. Okay. And so he says, although I am free in regard to all, I have made myself a slave to all. I've made myself a slave to all so as to win over as many as possible. So you get a sense, that's his mission. That is his mission, okay? To the weak, I became weak. Someone who's really good, someone who's passionate about art, and they want to learn something in art, they're going to learn how to do that discipline in art. They're just going to learn it. They're going to devote a year to it, 2 years to it, so they can learn it because they have such a passion for it. There's a story about Pope John Paul II that when he was first really becoming attracted to reading the writings of St. John of the Cross, which were originally written in Spanish, he so wanted to understand all the nuances of St. John of the Cross's theology that he learned Spanish just to do it. That's a man in love, but that's a man who's seeking, desiring competency and then gaining it, right? There is no spiritual depression in that whatsoever. There is no like, well, I can't learn another language. I don't have time to do that. He's not there, right? So it's beautiful. So St. Paul says, to the weak I became weak. So if there's people that I want to bring the gospel to, I'm gonna enter into their life. I'm not gonna expect them to come to me or become like me. I'm gonna enter into their life. So you think about people in your lives who are not accepting the gospel, don't have the gospel in their life, and you say, okay, I'm not gonna necessarily first expect them to change. I'm gonna change. I'm gonna change so that I can enter into their life. Now I say that with a certain level of hypocrisy in my own life. I cannot say I have mastered that. That is something I desire. Can't say I've mastered that. The desire is there, right? So maybe that's the first thing you say, okay, Lord, for this Lent coming up, I want to desire to enter into the lives of the people around me in a more humble, in a more patient, in a more kind way, so that I can become weak for the sake of the weak. And then what does St. Paul says? To win over the weak. Someone who's spiritually depressed is not thinking about winning over anybody, is not thinking about helping anybody, thinking just about themselves. Somebody who's spiritually competent, somebody who's hungry, somebody who's spiritually hungry is looking at winning people over and bringing people to Jesus Christ, right? This is not a competition to see how many people we can get, right? This is about helping people to encounter our Savior. I have become all things to all, to save at least some. I've done everything I can to do anything I can in order to bring the gospel. That's exciting. Okay. Now, one of the themes I've been preaching on quite a bit lately also is just about, it's about going all in, right? So St. Paul, he's all in. And it's not because life is a drudgery or he has no choice or he's a slave or just doing it out of obedience. He is so all in. His heart is just completely in it. There's nothing more beautiful than when you encounter someone of faith where they were just all in it. And they are all in it wholesale. They want to love their neighbor. They want to love God with all their heart. They want to bring their neighbor to God. It's beautiful. Okay, now I'm going to apply some of these things to Lent. So last week, remember I talked about Lent a little bit. So Lent is not the spiritual Olympics. It's not the time to prove how tough you are. It's not the time to say, yeah, look at what I gave up for Lent. Look how awesome I did. I think people too, like if they slip, like in their promise, if they say, okay, I'm going to give up coffee, and then one day they have coffee, that they just end up giving up coffee because it's like they no longer can get the gold medal, and so they're just going to give up. That's not Lent. Lent is to become weak, not to prove how strong we are. Is to enter into the gospel more fully, and to do that we must become weak. Lent, you know what Lent is? Lent is the season. Lent is the season when we learn how to become more spiritually hungry. Last week I gave a couple examples from my own life. I'm not going to repeat those, but just a couple things. So last year in Lent, one of the things I did was I gave up using the microwave oven. Now, I know it sounds silly, maybe it sounds silly. And to those of you who know how to cook and you don't use the microwave that much, that's no big deal. But for me, it was like the only thing I was using. And so by giving it up, I had to really change how I was preparing food for myself. And I had some kind of selfish reasons. I wanted to eat a little more healthy. I wanted to slow down because, as a priest, you can just get into this rhythm that's just like flying all day long. I wanted to slow down. I don't know if it really worked, but anyways, it was an attempt. And but by giving up the microwave, it did change the way I was viewing how I was eating. And I did start eating more healthy. But what also happened was it helped me develop a little more of an appreciation for the people who don't have everything that they could ever want in their kitchen or in their home. You know how when we have plenty of money we can buy, it's like, okay, I'm moving into a new apartment, these are all the things I need. But part of the gospel is learning simplicity. It's learning that there's a lot, I don't need a lot of those things, I really don't. Just rattling around in my mind for this coming Lent, I was just thinking today about it, maybe giving up my refrigerator. And so you say, well, how do you do that? Well, again, I live alone, so it's easier to do these things. But I would look at how I'm eating and doing those things. Now, in that, if you remember last week, I'm not doing this to prove how tough I am. One of the things I have to do if I'm going to do any of these things is I need to do it for someone. I need to do it as an act of love. That way, when I wake up in the morning and I've given up doing something, and instead of saying, oh, woe is me, and giving into like some spiritual depression, see, that's what people think about Lent. They think Lent is a time of spiritual depression where we're just all kind of sad and we're all kind of irritable because we gave up coffee and all these things. That's not what Lent is meant to be, okay? And so it's to develop a deeper hunger. Now, by doing these things, I do it for the sake of another. I do it, I say, okay, Lord, I'm going to do this so that I can learn more patience, or that I can be more kind, and then I remind myself of that. I'll write it down, I'll create lists that I can look at every day and say, okay, this is why I'm doing this or this. And it unites my heart more fully then to those who are weak. I make myself weak, right? I try to live life of more simplicity, or whatever it may be, for the sake of others. Okay, I'm going to go into a little bit in more detail. One of the things I'm offering during Lent in the parish, again, if you've never done this little program, I super recommend it. It's very good. There's a book by Father Bill Watson. Called The Whole Life Confession. It's a thin book. We did it last year in Mount Vernon with the 5 parishes up there. I thought it was phenomenal. It's not just about making a whole life confession. What you do is you enter into the life and the conversion of St. Ignatius of Loyola. And then as you enter into his life, you begin to understand the spiritual exercises that he developed. St. Ignatius of Loyola was kind of a dirtbag early on in life. He was a soldier. He was a soldier who loved war. He loved, maybe I'm going too far in saying this, but I say he loved killing because he loved war. He loved conquering the enemy. He loved all those things. He had bloodlust, right? And it's so easy, like in America, we tend to have bloodlust. If you look at the movies we watch, somebody's always being killed. The murder mysteries that are on TV, the fictional novels, somebody's always being murdered. And so there's almost kind of like this bloodlust that we have. Well, that's what St. Ignatius had. But he also had the other forms of lust, and he had other sinful qualities. And he didn't really begin to open his eyes to God until he was injured in battle and he was stuck in the hospital. And so that's when he started reading things like the Bible and Introduction to the Devout Life. Is that right? Introduction to the Devout Life? I think that was one of the books. Anyways, so he started reading spiritual things, and God then began to work on his heart. Now this book, The Whole Life Confession, what it does is it takes what he went through and how his entire heart began to hunger for God, began to hunger for the spiritual life. And he learned how to become spiritually competent to do that. And he then would begin sharing it with all kinds of other people. He became like St. Paul. So that's one of the programs we're going to do. You can order that book on Amazon, A Whole Life Confession by Father Bill Watson. You can order it. You can do it on your own. I'll probably be talking about it in some of my homilies during Lent. And then you find anyways, I'm not going to go into all that level, but it can become a great thing to develop spiritual competency, to develop spiritual hunger. Now, there's other things that during Lent, just keep gearing up for it. Spend the next week and a half really praying about what Jesus seeks and is desiring for you to be doing in your life. And remember, again, some of the other basic principles to keep in mind. Lent is meant to touch every moment of your day throughout Lent. So you have things that you're doing or things that you're giving up, sacrifices you're making for others that you do at home. Find something at home, right? Do something at work. Do something for your commute. Like say, okay, during Lent, I'm not going to listen to the radio while I'm commuting. I'm just going to pray the rosary. So while I'm driving, I'm praying the rosary during Lent. Something like that. That's something good. I think, in fact, as I'm saying that, I think that would be something really good for me to be doing. Something at church. Think of something you can do for Lent at church. So for the guys who don't sing at Mass, Lent is a great time to sing. And in our parishes, we're going to be using our musical instruments less. So we're going to be singing a cappella more, which is just with our voices. Because I want us to hear our voices. I want us to hear ourselves worship. And the people who are not singing, I want them to hear the fact that they're not singing. I want them to feel something and say, overcome the spiritual depression there, or spiritual pride, or whatever it is that's hindering you from worshiping God freely and being excited about it. So we're going to be working on that. So have something that you do when you're at church for Lent, that personally. So all of these things, again, I think are just great ways we become more spiritually hungry and we develop our competency in the Lord. All right, God bless. I'll talk to you next week.